And it's not just the general prophecy itself. It's the accurate details as well. For example, the prophet Isaiah foretold that the mighty city of Babylon would be destroyed. But then he went into detail exactly how the city would be defeated, from the river being dried up to the gates being left wide open. He even named the one who was going to overthrow Babylon some 200 years before it happened. And history confirms that every detail of this prophecy was fulfilled. It was even prophesied that Babylon would become piles of stone and never again be inhabited. And that stands true down to this day. And this is just one of a number of prophecies. You see, when we take the time to investigate, we find other prophecies, such as the number of years when the land of Judah would be desolate, the exact year when the Messiah would come, where he would be born, what he would do, how he would die and be raised from the dead. All fulfilled exactly as foretold. So the fact that so many Bible prophecies have already come true shows that we can trust what the Bible says about the future.
What we've just heard from William Turner is a flood of misinformation, all intended to bolster confidence in the Bible and ultimately point people towards becoming Jehovah's Witnesses. Again, this is a talk aimed at non-Jehovah's Witnesses. It's worth pointing out that even if what he's saying is true, and it isn't, as I'm going to demonstrate, that doesn't get you to being a Jehovah's Witness. There are many people who believe in the Bible as being God's infallible word who are not Jehovah's Witnesses. In fact, the vast majority of people who believe the Bible is God's inspired word are not Jehovah's Witnesses. Believing that the Bible is a reliable book of prophecy does not get you to Jehovah's Witnesses were invisibly chosen by Jesus in 1919. That would be a ridiculous stretch. So ultimately, his arguments fall flat on that basis. But what are his arguments regarding the inerrancy or authenticity of the Bible? Well, let's break them down to 4 claims that William Turner makes about Bible prophecy in this talk. We'll begin with the one about Isaiah.
The prophet Isaiah foretold that the mighty city of Babylon would be destroyed. But then he went into detail exactly how the city would be defeated, from the river being dried up to the gates being left wide open. He even named the one who was going to overthrow Babylon some 200 years before it happened.
Here is yet another example of them just repeating what they've already said in the convention. Mark Noumet already made these arguments on Friday, and now we're hearing them all over again. And rather than repeat my rebuttal to this idea that Isaiah predicted Cyrus, here is my sushi in which I explain why that isn't the case. If Tibor is gracious, a thumbnail will have appeared. There's simply no basis for asserting that Isaiah predicted Cyrus 200 years in advance, when obviously the far more plausible explanation is that these events were inserted into the book of Isaiah after the fact. And when scholars look at Isaiah, that's exactly the conclusion they come to. Rather than literally being written by Isaiah, what scholars conclude is that Isaiah was a work in progress for hundreds of years, and people would just go in and add things after those things had happened. So William Turner is making an argument here about the writers of Isaiah being clairvoyant that he simply cannot prove. Next, we have the tired old argument about Babylon being in ruins.
It was even prophesied that Babylon would become piles of stone and never again be inhabited. And that stands true down to this day.
Well, first of all, I think it can be contested that Babylon is completely in ruins. and completely uninhabited. In fact, this is an argument that was also brought up, because this stuff just gets repeated again and again and again. This was an argument that was also brought up in the Always Rejoice Convention. And in my Saturday morning rebuttal to the Always Rejoice Convention, if Tibor is gracious, a thumbnail is here, I go over Google Earth images of the site of ancient Babylon and argue that it's not totally uninhabited, it's not totally a pile of rubble. But even if we were to grant that, even if we were to prove definitively that there isn't a single human being living within the footprint of ancient Babylon today, and that it is effectively uninhabited, that does not prove the reliability of the Bible in terms of prophecy, because you then have to explain all of the ancient cities that were condemned by the Bible writers that were never totally destroyed or were never left uninhabited. And in the same video, I give the examples of Damascus, Gaza and Ashkelon, Tyre. The entire country of Egypt was condemned to annihilation and destruction by the Bible writers. None of these things happened. And quite frankly, if you're going to condemn enough ancient cities to total destruction, saying that one day this city will be uninhabited, eventually, given the passage of enough time, one of those cities is going to end up being deserted. That's just inevitable. So you can't point to just that one city and just that one prophecy and say this proves we can trust the Bible in terms of prophecy. What you're doing is you're cherry picking and you're ignoring all of the examples where the Bible writers actually get it wrong. William Turner's next proof of the reliability of Bible prophecy involves the number of years Judah is left desolate by the Babylonians.
We find other prophecies, such as the number of years when the land of Judah would be desolate.
So this is interesting, and it touches on what I've said previously about 607 BCE and the fact that the organization wrongly claims that 607 BCE was the year of the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, when all of the historians say differently. Essentially, what William Turner is saying only makes sense if you believe that Jerusalem was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 607 BCE. As I've pointed out, Jehovah's Witnesses, the only ones who say that. And as I point out in my 607 BCE video, the 70 years mentioned by Jeremiah actually doesn't apply in the verse to the destruction of Jerusalem. It applies to Judah being subservient to the king of Babylon. We see this in Jeremiah chapter 25, verses 11 and 12, which describes this 70-year period as being a period in which, quote, these nations will have to serve the king of Babylon. Obviously, Judah was serving the king of Babylon before the temple was destroyed. So even if you hold to JW chronology, this 70-year period wouldn't begin in 607. It would begin in, was it 617? When we learned in the Daniel drama that Nebuchadnezzar supposedly first besieged Jerusalem. But it wasn't in 617 when Nebuchadnezzar first besieged Jerusalem. It was actually 597. This is the date attested by historians and archaeologists. And if we take this 70-year period as beginning in 597, when Judah entered service to the king of Babylon, that takes us to 527, long after 539, when Babylon fell. In other words, this 70-year period doesn't actually work. Interestingly, this is pointed out in Richard Carrier's article, How We Know Daniel is a Forgery. He points out that Jeremiah gets it wrong when he's talking about this 70-year period of exile And he argues that the writers of Daniel are quite obviously jumping through hoops to try and compensate for this error in Jeremiah. But make no mistake, this is an error. Jeremiah did get it wrong. And the math only begins to make sense if you buy into the flawed reasoning, the frankly pseudo-history of Jehovah's Witness prophetic claims. And finally, in his list of prophetic proofs, William Turner points to messianic prophecies.
The exact year when the Messiah would come, where he would be born, what he would do, how he would die and be raised from the dead. All fulfilled exactly as foretold.
When William Turner talks about the exact year when the Messiah would come, I think he's referring to the 70 weeks prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, which again, I've already dealt with. If Tibor is gracious, a sushi will appear here. Bottom line, Daniel chapter 9 predicts no such thing. Actually, when you look at that verse and you look at what scholars have to say, this verse is not pointing to Jesus. It's actually pointing to the assassination of Ananias III, who was a high priest during the Seleucid dynasty. Even though many Christian fundamentalists like to point to the 70 weeks prophecy as something linking the Old Testament with the New Testament, on further analysis, it's obvious that Daniel chapter 9 does no such thing. And as to prophecies concerning where the Messiah would be born, what he would do, how he would die, and how he would be raised from the dead, obviously that's a case of the writers of the Gospels literally going through the Septuagint or going through copies of the Old Testament and doing essentially a box-ticking exercise where they're like, oh, we have to make Jesus fulfill this prophecy. It's sort of a clue, isn't it? When you're reading the Gospels and Jesus does something or says something, and it literally says in the text, he did this or he said this so that the words of insert name of Bible prophet might be fulfilled. That's a major clue, isn't it? That whoever's writing the Gospels is desperately trying to make Jesus fulfill as many messianic prophecies in the Old Testament as possible. So all of those points by William Turner can be easily refuted, and bottom line, as I said to begin with, even if we very generously grant him that each of these are valid arguments, and that the Bible is a book of prophecy and does predict things that will happen hundreds of years in the future, how does that get us to, therefore, Jehovah's Witnesses were chosen to be God's one true religion in 1919?